We have an august panel here today who will talk about their journeys in screenwriting. Our moderator is Barry Sandler, and I've only known him for a while, and he has been a successful and respected screenwriter for decades, dating back to the 1980s, Making Love, Crimes of Passion, The Mirror Cracked, and Kansas City Broken are some of his credits. Is that correct? Did I say Kansas City? Bomber. Oh, gosh. So, excuse me. I apologize for that. But most importantly, or not most importantly, but importantly to us, is that he's one of ours. He is here in Orlando and lives here in Orlando as part of the fabric of the community. He is a screenwriting teacher at the University of Central Florida. Please welcome Barry Sandler. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the screenwriting panel. And let me just introduce the panelists. It's a great group. To my immediate left is Teresa Bennett, who just completed writing and directing a film called Social Animals, which will be released by Paramount on June 1st. So be sure to look for that. And to her left is Justin Lader, who actually was a screenwriting student at UCF a few years ago, and in fact my student, and has gone on to great things from UCF to AFI to working extremely well and successfully in the industry. He's written a number of films, two recent films, The One I Love with Mark Duplass and Elizabeth Moss, and The Discovery with Jason Segel, Rooney Mara, and Robert Redford, which was out last year. And he has a number of projects he's working on currently, which he can talk about. Anything you want to specifically mention?
Oh, wow, right now? We'll see what happens.
Okay, we'll see what happens. Right, great. To Justin's left is Nick Nevada, who has a film at the festival called Say You Will, which screens today at 4:30 for anyone who wants to see it. I hear it's terrific. I haven't seen it, but I hear it's great. And Nick also has a film that's about to go into production next month called, with the great provocative title, Words on Bathroom Walls. So be sure to look for that one. And then to Nick's left is Don Mancini, who happens to be a great old friend of mine, and also a successful screenwriter and director, who created the Chucky franchise, which you all know, the great killer doll we're all fond of. Yes, indeed. And Don created the franchise and wrote all the scripts for it and has directed the last several of them as well. Don has also worked on a number of TV series, including Hannibal and Channel Zero for the Sci-Fi Channel. So it's our group. Let's welcome them. And great, thank you. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off with some basic fundamental questions about screenwriting and about working in the industry, and then we're going to open up to questions from you guys. So be thinking of questions you want to ask, and let's just begin by asking all the panelists how they got started in writing screenplays and working in the industry.
I actually got started in a very interesting and strange path. I was working as a waitress in New York at night, and I was working in a video store during the day to get my film education. Can you hear me? Okay. So I was working in a video store during the day to get my film education, and as a waitress at night, had no idea how to sort of break into the business or actually become a writer or a director. So one day I quit all of those jobs and decided to take the first job in TV or film that I could find, which was becoming a transcriber on Kathy Griffin, My Life on the D-List. So I would sit overnight and transcribe everything that Kathy said and kind of really learn the mechanics and raw footage of how a show is put together. So they liked my notes, and they liked sort of how I would flag notes for stories and story producers. And then I got recommended to a show in a 2-week entry-level job for Jerry Seinfeld's The Marriage Ref on NBC, which was a very short-lived reality show. But NBC, within 2 months, made me a casting field and story producer. They trained me in camera. I became my own DP, traveled around doing shoots all over the country, basically forcing people to fight with each other, which wasn't hard, married couples. And yeah, from there, I started my own reality company, wound up writing my first movie called Petunia, which came out in 2012, starring Brittany Snow and Thora Birch and Christine Lottie. That was a little tiny indie that wound up premiering and selling and having a nice little life. And then a couple years later, in between sort of doing reality shows and getting development deals on the unscripted side, I wrote my first film, and it took me about 6 years to finance it and find a cast. But yeah, I shot it in Austin last year, and it's coming out, and Paramount bought it, so we're super happy.
I have the exact same path. No, I grew up in South Florida. And when I came to UCF, I majored in film, like Barry said. And then from there, I went to AFI. And my thesis script at AFI, that was what I was lucky enough to get an agent and a manager off of that, and that sort of. I'm sure we'll get into all that later, but that was sort of what got my career going. It was this was about 2008 when I graduated from AFI, which, you know, we were talking about this last night a little bit. Like, it's always very scary to graduate from any sort of art school, but it's really scary when the economy crashes and there's a writer's strike going on at the exact same time. So it was interesting in that regard, but we that script sort of ended up functioning as my calling card, and that script was the script that wound up in the hands of Mark Duplass, who read it and met with my writing partner and one of my really close friends who also directs everything that we sort of come up with together, Charlie McDowell, and from there, from just based off that script, we ended up making The One I Love. And that was sort of how I began.
Sorry. So I'm from Southern California, and I guess I grew up kind of like many of you, sort of obsessed with movies and screenplays, and so I'd always been writing. I went to college for English, but you know, I still knew that I wanted to make movies, and my first job in the industry was working for sort of an actor, writer, director. I did that for 3 years, and during that time, I was, even though like I'm from Southern California, living in LA felt very different from sort of like the suburbs where I was from, and I was kind of missing a lot of people that I grew up with and my family and stuff. And so I wrote this script called Say You Will that was sort of based on a lot of my experiences and people that I knew growing up, and that script is what got me representation as I was an assistant. And about a year after I wrote the script, I met producers who, you know, saw my shorts and was like, we should make this movie. And so we went out and got financing and shot the movie in the summer of 2016. And then we premiered it at the Seattle International Film Festival in 2017, and we will be distributed later this year. So other than that, the day job is writing. You know, I would like to continue directing all my own stuff, but writing is how I pay the bills. Because of Say You Will, I started sent some young adult books and things like that, because the book's about teenagers. And I found this book called Words on Bathroom Walls, which is basically a coming-of-age story about a kid with schizophrenia. And I went and I kind of, with a director, kind of pitched my take on the movie, which is sort of like Silver Linings Playbook, but in high school. And this company called LD Entertainment financed the development, and I wrote it this past fall. And then in the winter, they said, we want to shoot this movie in May. And so we are in prep right now with Charlie Plummer as the lead.
Hi. So I grew up in Virginia, and like everyone else here, was movie mad, and I did my first 2 years of college at Columbia University as an English major, also like you. I knew that I wanted to get into film, but your access to the film program at Columbia at that time as an undergrad was kind of limited. So I took a year off from school and I worked on a soap opera in New York, actually, called Search for Tomorrow, which at the time was the oldest soap opera. Was a lot of fun. I got my union card. I went from being a utility guy, which when you're doing 3-camera video production in a studio, like you've got sets all around and you like shoot this set, this set, this set, this set. My job was to make sure that the cables on the cameras didn't get all wound up. And to this day, I am awesome at looping the garden hose because of that. Anyway, so then after that, I transferred to UCLA as a film major, and I wrote the first Child's Play script as a student while I was there, and basically got very, very lucky, and got my first agent with that script, and the movie got made, and here I am.
Great, thanks. I'd like to talk about the role of the screenwriter in a constantly changing industry, as we're experiencing with expanding markets for material, constantly hungering for content. How has your experiences evolved or changed over the last number of years since you started in terms of these expanding marketplaces? Do you find greater opportunities or more restrictions? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Teresa, you want to say?
I mean, it feels like a really amazing time to be a writer and to actually be selling material because there are so many outlets. I feel like the world has just opened up in the last 5 years where there are hundreds of streaming outlets and different production companies and studios looking for this like plethora of content. And what's cool is you don't really need to think about what the climate is right now and what you need to sell or what feels like the right movie based on box office. It really is just about writing what's in your heart and what you want to write. And as a woman, it seems like more and more people are looking for female-driven content and people are looking for more than just one type of voice. It seems like we're really expanding that landscape and looking a little more for a variety. I think there are a variety of voices in the world, and there should be a variety of voices in film. And I think box offices and people at home who are demanding content and buying content are also proving that as well. So it just feels like a really awesome time to just write what you want to write and not have to worry so much about what people are specifically looking for.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm just curious, how many, it's funny to ask this, but raise your hands if you're writer-directors. And if you're only a writer. Okay, it's interesting because now, more than ever, as Teresa was saying, there's a lot of opportunities out there, and there are a lot of scenarios where you don't have to wait for somebody to find you, and you could generate your own content. What I tell a lot of people, especially people that are trying to make their first film, the way that we made The One I Love, which was primarily one location on a big piece of property and essentially just 2 actors, was we went to that property before we had a script. We knew what actors primarily were going to be in the movie. We had a rough idea of what our budget was going to be. And then we reverse engineered a script based on the resources we already had access to. The first script that I wrote at AFI that got me my agent and manager that I wrote, like I said, right when the economy crashed, it was very tough to get financed. And I thought at the time I was doing it the right way. It was a low budget movie. I think it was budgeted at $2.5 million. It had sort of a high concept hook to it. So I was like, oh, this is something that could realistically get made. And we surrounded ourselves with an amazing team to go get the movie made, but then you still had to go out and get everything to make it. I think The One I Love came together so quickly because, like I said, we took inventory of the resources we already had access to. And I'll give you an example. I don't know how many people saw the movie, but there's a major plot point in the movie that has to do with the guest house. And that plot point never would have occurred to me had I not known there was a guest house on the property. So we were literally building the script based on what we had to work with. And I think that's an amazing way to make your first film. And now with streaming services and the thriving online platforms to release these films, it's this weird thing where when I was first starting out, you write a script and that's sort of your calling card. Now it's so exciting because you could actually make a movie and your movie can be your calling card. And I think it's a really exciting time to start working.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you guys said. Like maybe many of you guys here, I grew up sort of obsessed with sort of independent American cinema of the 90s, like Tamara Jenkins and Richard Linklater and people like that, and I just I feel like maybe getting a film like that made and seen felt so pie in the sky maybe when I was younger, and now you can actually make it, and there's VOD, and you can actually even with a lesser known cast, and maybe it didn't win the grand jury prize at Sundance, it could still be seen and find an audience, and you can continue to make films like that. I think it's really a great time to be making stuff for that reason.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like as pretty much the elder statesman on this panel, I have a different perspective on all of this. Where it is absolutely true that there are so many more opportunities for emerging filmmakers now, and I feel like I'm benefiting from that to some degree, just because there's just a lot going on. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm profoundly grateful to still be doing this. But when I started out in the 80s and the 90s, there was so much money. It was just, the world was different, Hollywood was different, and it sounds almost cavalier or glib to say it, but these were days when you could literally, like, you'd have like a general meeting and just like driving on your way, what am I going to talk about at this meeting? And you'd come out of it with a deal. So, and those days are long gone, and I sort of pine for them. So in a weird way, I think because of when I started out, I was a little bit spoiled in terms of how you could make a living doing this. And it's just, there's just a lot less money now. And I think that's probably true in many industries, if not most industries. But as they've all said, the upside of that is that there are so many more opportunities and just a spectrum of ways to get your work out there and seen.
Yeah, just to echo that, I noticed, because when I started, sure, there were only like 6 or 7 film schools in the country, so you didn't have much competition in terms of trying to break into the business, but you were limited in terms of there were only a handful of studios, a few independent companies, and very limited television opportunities. It's changed, as Don said. Remember, in the 80s, the Canadian financing was a big source of revenue where you could go to get your films made. Vancouver became like a second Hollywood. Today, the advantage, of course, as these guys have said, the number of outlets and venues where you can pitch your projects and get financing is numerous between the Amazons and Netflix and Hulus and other. But at the same time, along with this hunger for content, there's a lot more competition. There's a lot more people who are trying to break into the business. So it kind of evens out. But I would say today, as Teresa echoed, that it's a terrific opportunity if you're trying to break in, because there are so many outlets to be and such a hunger for content. Triggering off that, just talk about, in terms of your personal approaches to your writing, to your craft, what determines what you're going to write? What inspires you to write? Where do you get, I constantly get asked, where do you get your ideas from? What inspires you? What determines what you're going to write?
I would say just interaction, just talking to people and really hearing them. I think I come from a background where I was sent all over the country to interview thousands of people. So I got the chance to really talk to people who had insanely different perspectives from mine. I'm a neurotic New Yorker from the Upper West Side. I surround myself with a lot of people who share my perspective. Traveling around the country, talking to those people really changed the way I write characters. So that also really inspired me to talk to other people and really listen. So really just a line, something someone says, something from a conversation, something that happens in life while waiting online at the coffee shop or whatever, that can really inspire me to write an entire script, and of course relationships and love and heartbreak and happiness and all of those things, all of those emotions go into your script, where it's sort of like where you put your heart on those pages.
I tend to think in terms of concept first. So for me, it's kind of as simple as what if question. What if this happened? Then you sort of kind of try to break it down. And okay, now what if it really happened? That's sort of how I start. And then I just sort of put it in the back of my head, and I'm maybe working on other things. And as the weeks go by, or maybe even months, if I find myself still thinking about that idea, I start to get more inspired, and there's something about it where I think, oh, maybe this is worth diving a little deeper in. It's it's interesting. There are obviously good ideas, then there's good ideas for movies, then there's good ideas for TV shows. So it's about, I think for me personally, it's about what sort of sticks in my head, and based on the idea, how many, is there enough meat on the bone to sustain a movie? Then how do the characters fit in? But for me, it's always like a what if idea. That's kind of how it starts for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. I try and treat it like a job. I like to keep up a good work ethic, be writing by like 9 a.m. and then stop by like 4. Because I feel like I heard somebody say this once, if you don't set like a time to write, you're writing all the time and you're not living your life. And I feel like that's really important for my process, because so much of my work is based on, my family, friends, people I know, lived experiences, like I'm sure many other writers. And I feel like if I'm not making time to live my life and actually like experience things, then I'm just going to be writing a movie about somebody writing a movie, And so that's really important to me.
So do you like work from 9 to 4? Like
yeah, every day.
Nonstop?
Yeah, every day. Unless there's like meetings and something, other things going on.
Impressive. As someone who tends to specialize in horror, I don't have to look very far these days for inspiration. And I think that's it's one of the reasons why horror is kind of a perennial in show business, and but particularly now we're seeing such a huge boom. And I don't think it's accidental. When I shot the last Chucky movie in Canada at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. So I literally flew up to Canada the day after the election, and ask myself that all the time. Anyway, as we were in pre-production on the movie, it's strange when you go into that situation. You're in this bell jar, and it was that sense was underlined by the fact that I had gone to another country. Very different weather. It was in the winter. It was 40 below, but it created this weird situation where all this drama was happening back home in the United States, the inauguration and all this stuff. And it just seemed like every day I would get up to go to work, and I'd turn on the news and see, some new horrifying atrocity that was going on in Washington. And I became very conscious of the fact of, I said, I hope the anxiety that I feel every day is going to seep into the movie somehow, because if it does, then the movie will be successful because it will scare people. Anyway, but I'm very interested in your 9 to 4 work ethic because we were talking about this last night in Barry's class. I feel like particularly when I'm starting out on a new project, I have to set myself extremely easy goals so that I make them where I literally will say, okay, I'm just going to write literally a sentence today, and then I get to go shopping or whatever it is. Oh. And I literally will do that for a week. And then on the second week, it's okay, well, today I'm gonna finish this paragraph or do this scene, but just keep the goals incredibly easy. But for me, it really makes a difference. And then as I start to accumulate work and pages, I get energized, and then I can actually adhere to a more adult schedule, like you apparently have mastered already.
Yeah, I don't know. I've tried the reward system, and
shopping is the reward.
Yeah. No, I've tried it, and it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't work for me. But
you guys are so healthy. My system is just guilt and self-loathing and then more guilt, and then I promise myself I'll start writing the next day, and then 2 weeks go by, and then I start. That's sort of how it is for me. I mean, that's true. I'm not lying. But also, I realized, I was saying this last night in Barry's class, that my process is constantly changing project to project, and each time I finish a script, I'm like, this is it. This is how I'm going to do it from now on. And then a new project will come along, and I'll find that I completely blow up that system, and it's like the project oddly dictates it. It's in a weird way, and I literally mean that, what the subject matter is. And I'm just thinking right now, it's oh, that's they say method actors, I'm a method screenwriter. I don't know what that means. But for me, I found that no matter what, the one sort of common denominator is I'm never not thinking about it. And I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but you said something earlier that stuck in my head about you do the 9 to 4 because if you don't do that, you're always writing. Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you mean always writing in the sense that you're physically sitting in front of the computer. So for me, I find that I am always writing, whether I'm in the shower or whether I'm out with friends or doing anything, grocery shopping, whatever it is. It's either in the back of my head or the front of my head, and whatever I'm working on. And so as much as I probably lean too heavily on procrastination, I do think there's something to just sort of letting your subconscious kind of dream a little bit and trust in the fact that you're going to sit down and write it, and you're going and your subconscious is going to do a lot of work. David Lynch has this phrase that I love where he doesn't say come up with an idea or come up with a story. He says catch ideas, almost like you're fishing. And I think that's beautiful, but I think there's also something really true in that. I struggle with the 9 to 4 thing because I do want to treat it like a job. But I think, and this is just I think everybody has to find out their own sort of process. But for me, it's it's artistic, and as long as I'm always thinking about it, which I am, I'm confident that I might miss a couple deadlines, but I'm confident that I'll finish.
I think my process is probably very different from everybody else on this panel, although I do have a lot of guilt and self-loathing and shopping involved. But typically, I'm like a binge writer. I don't set hours. I literally start out by writing one scene, usually just to get the melody of the words and the characters and to really get to know them. I'm a very character-driven writer. So I'm a big fan of letting characters drive. But after that, I kind of put a playlist together and I write to music. So I typically will put together a playlist of 10 or 11 songs. I then obsess over that for like 2 or 3 days, and I listen to it in my car, I listen to it on the treadmill, I listen to it constantly until I can close my eyes and see the movie. Once I really can close my eyes and see the movie, it feels like the whole story is just sitting in my head and I need to get it out. So it feels like a sick feeling, actually. Like I really just want to get it done. So my process to write my first draft is really fast. Typically it's like 1 to 6 days, 6 being a really long time. From there, most of my process is reading and reading and reading and rewriting. So I just read it so many times that I hate it, I love it, I think it's terrible, I think it's awesome. I really go through like the stages of grief with a script until I finally reach acceptance, and then I deliver it.
Great.
I love the idea, though, of you know, when the studio or network executives inevitably call you with that, like, so how's it going? You know, and like, what do they think you're gonna say? Oh my God, I'm fucking it up worse than ever this time. But I think that like next time I'm gonna say, like, my subconscious is really working hard this week.
I have anxiety attacks with the just checking in email.
Oh my God,
And
it's the worst.
It's the worst because I'll get a just checking in email before I've even started working on this.
But is your house really clean? Because it's like I had like the cleaning ritual. I don't like some people are.
No.
That's just like for me. I mean, it's just like I have to have everything spotless in order to write that sentence.
That's really fun.
Well, do you find writing on spec gives you greater, you know, flexibility and liberty to write, you know, your own page?
Flexibility, yes, but in the absence of the deadline,
Yeah.
like good luck. But I just think it's about. I mean, I bet we all have like some overlap in the processes, and what Teresa, what you were like saying about like the going through those 5 stages of grief or whatever it is with screenwriting. I identify with that too.
Yeah, I always found writing on spec was just a lot easier because I could write at my own pace and it didn't have that pressure. But at the same time, you know, it's on spec, so you're taking a risk that, you know, you could put a lot of time and effort and no one will buy it. The development process, obviously, you're getting paid, but still you're under that.
And then working in television, it's all,
Well,
you know,
I'm
that's
glad
a
you
whole
brought that
other
up.
thing,
That
too.
was going to, I want to address that next because for years there was a distinct line between writing for film and writing for television, and there was very little crossover. But in the last few years, the lines have been blurred, and I know a lot of writers write both. And I know that Don and Justin and Therese, I don't know about you, Nick, but do go from film and television back and forth. Can you talk about the differences or the advantages and disadvantages of one over the other between writing for film and writing for television?
Well, I kind of write shows that I create, so it's a little bit different. I mean, I've always kind of been curious and I've always romanticized being in a writer's room because it feels like such an awesome, very collaborative process, but you could probably speak to that far more than I could.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I still am actually a Saturday Night Live fan. I'm a little embarrassed to admit, but like I started watching it as a kid when it first came on, and I had this huge romantic notion of what it would be like, you know, staying up all night, doing all that coke, you know, and just like how amazing it must have been. And it turns out, well, I mean, I've never written for Saturday Night Live, but it's not really like that. But the writer's room experience I love, and it's still relatively new for me. I've only worked on 2 different shows in the last 3 or 4 years, but just to go from the loneliness and isolation and sheer horrifying responsibility of being a writer-director and everything is on your shoulders, and going into a situation where you're part of a brain trust, it was liberating, and we were talking about this last night too. I never consider that part of it work. It just feels fun to me. Where like the first show I worked on was Hannibal, and I was a huge fan of the show before I worked on it. I was a huge fan of the franchise, the books, the movies. So I you know, it's like, oh wait, we come to work every day with 7 like-minded people and talk about Hannibal all day and we get paid for it. I would do that for free. So that part of it I really love, and I think it's also affected my feature writing work as well, because from having worked in TV for a few years, I had to get faster. I mean, I've never been a terribly slow writer, but I wouldn't have considered myself fast the way that you have to be in TV, and that was a great discipline to develop, a great muscle to work on. Like I was going to make another point and I've forgotten it. Anyway, the writer's room part of it, I really love.
I loved what you said last night about kind of writing with no ending. And that really is what episodic is, and I think that's what makes it so incredibly fun, that you're writing the show that just goes on and on and on. And I think that's what people tend to ask you when you write a pilot, or what they ask me at least when I go in and pitch a pilot, is what's going to happen on the next 100 episodes? Why is this going to be a 5-season show or a 10-season show? And, what's your series arc? So I think that's what makes it really fun, as opposed to film where you have some kind of resolution. TV just kind of goes on forever.
Yeah, I mean, for me, long-form storytelling from a writing perspective is incredibly exciting. I think it's the closest thing in a visual medium you could get to the novel. And TV, when I have a movie at a film festival and I get asked, like, the inevitable, like, what's your favorite movies and your biggest inspirations in film? And I have a lot, but I always disappoint, like, really sort of film-centric people, because for me, like, my biggest influences were always TV shows. Like, The Twilight Zone was huge for me, but, like, on Mount Rushmore for me is a show like The Sopranos. And the idea of long-form storytelling where you have a season-long arc and you better deliver on that arc and it better be good, but each episode thematically is about something and has some sort of thematic through line, a beginning, middle, and an end, while servicing that arc. That's so appealing to me. And I actually feel like if you're doing episodic television where each episode is sort of while servicing that arc, are conceptualized as being standalone thematically, the way that we like binge shows sort of kills that a little bit. Now serialized shows, it's amazing with binging, but when you have that sort of show that's designed for an episode to kind of stand on its own, you kind of lose the contemplative nature, I think, in binging, because you're on to the next one and you're almost like addicted to it. But for me, when I was at UCF, this was before the TV boom, and I was always trying to think of television show ideas, and my classmates were always trying to think of film ideas. And then by the time I got to AFI and the shift happened where everyone was trying to come up with their television show idea, I started to get resentful. Like, TV's my thing. Like, stick to movies. And it just happened that, like, my work, because, it was, like Barry said, like, years ago, it was always writers in television were paying the bills, but they were like struggling feature writers or aspiring feature writers. My first jobs out of film school were feature. So my joke was that I was a struggling television writer earning a living in features, because that's always what I wanted to do. I just think there's something really special about long form storytelling that's really appealing. I love movies, but there's something really exciting in TV, especially right now with the kinds of stories you can tell. There's a reason why not just writers but actors and directors are going to TV, because there's a hunger for complicated, interesting stories that actually have a mood, that actually have atmosphere, that there's a rhythm that you it's really hard unless you're coming up with a very an indie film essentially, that you could get financing because you cast an actor that brings in money. But the notion, like what I always say, and Teresa and I talk about this a lot, the movies that I grew up on, that we kind of now like look back on with nostalgia and call the middle class of movies, they kind of don't exist anymore. Like those mid-budget movies, those movies that are between like 30 and 90, that just don't, there's not a hunger for people to see them in theaters anymore. And so I feel like that those types of movies have now crossed over and into television. those stories, and that's what you're seeing, and it's really exciting.
Thank you. You know, I see there's a number of writer-directors in the audience, and I know that Nick and Don and Teresa are also writer-directors. Can you talk about how directing has shaped and informed your writing? I know we all started out as writers, and certainly writer-directors started out as writers. How is then taking the leap into directing your material, how does that shape you as a writer, and how does that shape your material as a writer? Nick, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I'm writing what will hopefully be my second feature right now, and I always joked that I wish I can go back to a time of writing before I had made a feature, you know, because you're like weighed down by like just the baggage of production and how hard it is to make it. You know what I mean? Like it's, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like it's like you've seen how the sausage is made, and now you're thinking about it in a different way, you know, like, well, how am I going to achieve this, and how are these locations going to work, and all this kind of stuff, and you're really thinking about, you know, heavily, you know, budget and actors and all the things that kind of like the unsexy things about making a movie, you know. So yeah, so I guess that's what I have to say about it.
I mean, I totally agree. I think when I made my first movie, I didn't direct it. A friend of mine directed it. And yeah, I wrote a million locations. I mean, literally, we had to change them on the spot. It was like 4,000 company moves, and we had to go from here to there, and it was almost impossible. Like, it became a little ridiculous towards, like, when we got to production, we were like, okay, we need to minimize this. So I think with the second movie I wrote that I decided to direct, I really wrote it to be made. So I didn't write and shoot for the stars. I didn't write this kind of like over-the-top spec that could be made for $100 million. I was like, you know what? I want to make a movie I can make for under $1 million that makes sense, that production-wise I can actually, like, you know, go and feasibly shoot and have 23 days. And I just think you become really conscious as a writer of what works on screen, how to actually get it on screen, like with all of the logistics. And also, I think you know, as I write movies moving forward after directing my first feature, I think a lot about performance, and I think a lot about what I want from the actors, and sort of, you know, how to get that and how to write those characters in a way that I can really capture, if that makes sense.
I had always wanted to write and direct, and I kind of, you know, as a kid, I think my heroes tended to be writer-directors, and I always viewed it as kind of like all part of the same process. When we were talking about this last night in Barry's class as well, I finally got my opportunity with having created the Chucky franchise, and I just stuck around long enough that they couldn't get rid of me after a while. And so it's on Bride of Chucky, I directed Second Unit, and that finally got me into a place where I could direct my first film proper. And the experience was really traumatic for me the first time, partly because we were shooting in Romania, and so I was a long way from home and out of my comfort zone, and so I'm sure that was part of it. Just being a first-time director with, you know, 3 puppets as the lead, it is also its own nightmare. But this is something I'd been dreaming about my entire life, and so here I am actually doing it, and I would, you know, for the first probably 3 weeks or something, I would come home and cry, because I was just thinking, I'm not suited to this. And then I got to the point, it's similar to the 5 stages of grief that you were talking about, that I was like saying, it's okay, I'm not a director, it's fine, I'm just a writer, and I'm gonna get through this like lots of people do, and it'll be a footnote if anyone ever remembers it. But it gets better. And now, having done 3 now, I just the experience of it and getting that under my belt, I love it now. And I think, like, directing movies and writing in television, it's so social as compared to the solitary life of just like being a feature writer. I think having done that for 25 years, I'm just like ready to spend time with people now.
I think Something that Teresa touched on, which was writing something that is meant to be made. When I was coming up, and I think still this is the philosophy, like a writer, from the writer side of things, it's like, okay, how do I get an agent and a manager? Well, how do I get an agent and a manager to read my script? Well, I got to get on the blacklist. If you're not familiar with the blacklist, it's a list that executives put together once a year of the best unproduced screenplays, and a lot of writers start their career and based on that. And a lot of times those scripts are really, I hesitate to use a word like quirky, but a lot of times they're really creative scripts that executives that have to read 100 scripts in a month or whatever that number is. The script that they vote on the blacklist is a script that's unique and fresh and is a breath of fresh air with all the sort of redundant, monotonous scripts that they're reading. And a lot of times I've found when you look at that list on the blacklist is those are scripts that are meant to be read more than they're meant to be made. And a lot of times those scripts don't get made. Now you go on to have a great career based on that script. So I find that it's a balancing act, because you don't want to be, when you're writing something that's meant to be made, you don't want to like inhibit the creativity by thinking like, okay, what's 100% practical? Can I do this? Maybe I can't do this. You sort of don't want to be thinking about that stuff when you're coming up with ideas, at least in the first draft. But by the second draft, I think, and this is for writers who maybe aren't directors also, your goal should always be to write something that will eventually get made. So I think there is something beneficial about once you get that first draft done, you're rereading it to make it a better movie creatively. There's something of value to reread it under the guise of what if this was actually going to get made. Now, like Teresa said, with her first script, there were a lot of locations. Is there a way to condense that? Is there a way? Did these two characters? Is there a way to maybe make them one character? Like, there's a whole other element, I think, to writing than just the creative. And I think that goes to how do we get this made? A book or a novel that could have 1,000 locations. It could span, centuries, and there's no budget constraints. So it's smart to write with that in mind, that you're writing something that's supposed to be made. But like I said, it is a balancing act, because I find at least, if you begin writing thinking about the practicalities of film production, for me, it's a little bit inhibiting. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, I think.
Well, I think what has helped you come to that conclusion, and I think you and I are the only ones on the panel who have not directed, but we've been very closely aligned with directors on the films and been on set and seeing the production process in action, and also being in the editing room. That definitely helps you as a writer. I know you learn what scenes are expendable for the next time you write a script. So I think it's very important, if you're not directing, at least to be involved in the production.
Yeah.
It just really helps. We're a little more than halfway through, and I know there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. So let's open up the floor to questions from the audience. Great. Okay. Gentleman in the front. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. But while we're setting it up, we had a question right.
I'm right
Oh,
here.
ready? Okay.
Hello.
All right, we'll come back to you. All right.
Hi. First, thanks so much to y'all for being here. Question for Justin Latter in reference to The One I Love. Mark Duplass often works off scriptments, and although One I Love was brilliant and it definitely had a solid structure, watching it, it felt like it had that tone to it. So was that kind of based on a scriptment? And if so, could you elaborate? And then for all the panelists, what do you think about these newer filmmakers working off scriptments?
Yeah, for The One I Love, it was interesting. So we had a very, very concise timeline. I'll try to get through this quickly, but we conceptualized the idea in October, and we had to, for a variety of reasons, if we didn't hit an April start date, we wouldn't have been able to make the movie. So Charlie and I were trying to get what I said before, my thesis script back at AFI. For years we were trying to get that made. So and we just couldn't. We would cast
interesting actors, and then it would always be pushed. The money would fall apart at the last minute. And once we sort of realized we had an opportunity to make a movie in April, or it would have to get pushed, we were like, that was a scary word, because we realized pretty quickly that pushed was code for never going to happen. So if this movie didn't come together by April, it wasn't going to be because we didn't deliver on our end. So what ended up happening was, for those of you who don't know, a scriptment is basically, we describe it as kind of a short story or a novella with slug lines, interior or exterior. But we wrote every single scene, what happens in the scene, lines of dialogue, except not formatted in dialogue, but in quotes. And so the movie was 90 minutes. The scriptment was the first 60 minutes, so 60 pages. And then the last 30 were completely scripted, because, again, this is not going to mean much to people who haven't seen the movie, but there's a lot of visual effects in the last 30 minutes, which meant that actors couldn't kind of riff off a template of dialogue, because you shoot very specifically for effects-heavy sequences. So it was this really weird exercise for me, where the first half of the movie was a scriptment with dialogue parceled throughout, but the last 30 pages were completely scripted. So I wrote the last 30 pages as an actual script without having scripted the first 60 pages, which was, really difficult to do, because you haven't really heard the actors interact yet. And then when we were on set, what I would do is either the night before the scene or the morning before we started shooting, I would write the dialogue for that day. Because what we learned very quickly, like most of Mark Duplass's movies, like Your Sister, Sister, and other films that he's gone off a scriptment for, don't have a lot of scenes. They're not a genre movie like The One I Love was. We had, I think, like 100 and something scenes in The One I Love. So to have a scene pacing-wise that would only be like a 2-minute scene, we didn't have the luxury for Elizabeth Moss and Mark Duplass to kind of riff for an entire day on a scene that's supposed to be 30 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever. So it was helpful, and I don't know how we did this, because it was like a rat race, but it was helpful to script the dialogue for the scene, either, like I said, the night before or the morning before we would start shooting. And from a pacing standpoint, the actors knew kind of what the feel and the momentum of the scene would be. So even if they didn't follow the dialogue to a T, they realized, okay, so for these first 3 lines, it's kind of, we're riffing back and forth, but by line 4, I need to say this, so you then say that, which pivots us into the next scene. I compare it a lot to, even though it's completely tonally different, to Curb Your Enthusiasm. Because a lot of people think when you hear the word improvise that you're just sort of making it up on the fly as you go. The only reason The One I Love worked was because Charlie and I had a solid foundation in every single scene. What happens, what the characters are saying, what they're feeling emotionally was completely ironed out. We were definitely not making it up as we went along.
You also need really good actors to pull that off, which you
Oh
had,
my God,
too.
yeah.
Sure. Anyway, next question.
Hi, my name's Colleen. I'm a film and TV student. My question's for the panel. Anyone can answer this. I was wondering if you follow a certain structure, if maybe you follow Aristotle's model, or you just incorporate the archetypes, or if you use Egri's premise, or maybe you don't have any structure at all and just kind of, like you said, wing it. Is there any structure to your writing?
I wing it. I'm aware of structure, certainly, and I think the more you write and the more scripts you write, you sort of have this idea of where everything's supposed to come in and what page it's supposed to come in on. But I definitely don't, apply any of those specific structures. I free write, so I pretty much just have the idea, go through the script. I write chronologically, so I really write the movie straight through, maybe skipping a couple scenes here and there and going back. But yeah, that's basically at least my process.
For me, I think structure is important. I don't think formula is, if that makes any sense, because I think our job is to surprise people. I think surprise, is a good emotion. And I think there's something, I think you need to know, I said this last night, like my favorite movies and TV shows, especially if you're writing something that's supposed to be lifelike, you don't know, nothing's guaranteed in life. Anything can happen right when we leave this theater, so there shouldn't be a predictability to the writing. I think there needs to be a sound structure. I think you need to know where your story's going. Last night in Barry's class, I compared it to like a road trip. Like if you're starting in Florida and ending in New York, you know you're going. You know you need to get to New York, but the fun is kind of how you get there and what little side exit you want to get off of on the highway and the little fun side adventures. I think that's really important when you're writing something, because I don't think you want people to sort of be ahead of your movie.
Yeah, I free write as well. I wing it for the most part, but how I know I'm kind of ready to start writing is when I have a really strong sense of how it begins, how it ends, and whatever that big kind of midpoint moment is, in the story. I know that means a lot of things, but whatever that is, whenever I find those three things, I feel like I'm ready to start writing. And sometimes I'll outline heavily, like around those kind of three beats that I have in my head, or three moments that I have in my head, or sometimes I'll just start writing it. But I'll always write the film in order. Like I have a strange superstition about not skipping around until I'm revising.
I wonder if this is an age thing or just like when I came up, and Barry, I'd be interested to hear your feelings about this. But I definitely adhere to a kind of, I guess, Aristotelian three-act structure, which is just something I was taught in English classes, but also in film classes. But so I think it's something I've just kind of internalized and do it. But I can't say I would do it without thinking about it, because, and this is where I have the question for you guys. I mean, contractually, everything I do, I have to outline.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's just something I've been doing for 30 years. So I outline very, very heavily, but the older I get, the more I do this, the more drastically I deviate from the outline when I'm writing, and because I feel like that's really when it comes alive, when you have that kind of inspiration. For me, it's I don't really know what I'm doing. Other than the structure, I don't feel like it really clicks for me until I get to a point where the characters are talking to one another in such a way that it's like, oh, I get this now. I can hear them now. And then that will suggest all kinds of drastic new ideas and directions and differences that often will drive networks and studios crazy, because they don't, they expect to get their outline that they paid for or that you turned in. So like now I feel like I'm in this new realm where when I'm changing things, like the question is, okay, do I flag it and tell them, oh, I had this idea? One of the benefits of doing that is you're circumventing that horrible phone call, the how's it going phone call. You swim out to the wave and say, oh, I've been working really hard. My subconscious has been working overtime and I had this new idea. But the risk with that is they're going to go, no, we don't want that. We want what you did in the outline. So really, what I've learned is that they don't really always read the outlines, and you can make drastic changes, and they'll say, oh yeah, it works great.
I think there's overlap in what we're talking about. I think for me, I have pages and pages that. The term outline sort of scares me a little bit. So what I do is I have a notebook filled with pages and my ramblings, and also on my computer, and it looks like if it was written in crayon, you'd think I was a serial killer. But I sort of understand it, and I think, and I think so. Well, there's two things to what you said. But I'll finish with what I was saying. I think I'm sort of similar to you. Like in the very beginning, the first act, I'm sort of constantly going over my notebook and what I've written out, that if you piece it together nicely, it would probably fit the parameters of an outline. And as I sort of get going, I find that I start typing in a separate document, whether it's in Final Draft or Word, the stuff that I have in my notebook and the stuff that I had in my other files, and it sort of takes the shape of an outline. And then by the time I'm almost done with Act 1, I find that I stop looking at it completely, because whether it's somehow in my head, I just sort of know it, and then I sort of, I'm definitely not what you said.
See, I've always worked from an outline. I can't write a script without having a really
I'm in the middle.
Strict, rigid out. But I tell this to my students. I mean, the outline serves you in terms of structuring your script beat by beat by beat, so that once you have the story from beginning, middle, and end, you at least have a sense of where you're going. But not a scene by scene outline necessarily, but a beat by beat, step by step. This happens, then this happens, and this happens, so that when you sit down to write the script, it's a lot easier. You have your story structured out, and you're able to then construct your scenes from the story and write the dialogue. So I mean, I think you need, yeah, Teresa, go.
I think because, like I'll sit down and write my first draft, which is a terrible draft that no one should ever read, within like 48 hours. That actually is my outline. So I think I kind of use that draft I spit out as my outline, and then as I'm rewriting, that's my real writing process. But I will say my exception was writing a horror movie, where I really did have to have a beat by beat, moment to moment outline. I had a co-writer, this great co-writer, Justin McCormick, on the movie. We wrote a horror movie that we were hired to write that was like a slasher movie at a summer camp. And I remember really having to beat out the movie because even the geography of someone running from one place to another became so complicated that there was really no way to free write a movie like that. So I don't know if it's like an age thing or whatever, or more of like a genre thing. Right. Because in horror, I really do. I just actually wrote a horror piece, and I really did now that I'm thinking about it, I did sit and beat it out as I went.
Yeah, like I said, I think there's a lot of overlap. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think that also the difference is, like you said, when somebody's hiring you to write something, I've been lucky in the sense that everybody that's hired me to write something, whether it's a production company or a studio or whatever, I love collaboration, and I love talking about ideas, and I love spitballing. So even if I don't hand in an ironclad outline, before I even start writing, because the nightmare scenario is you just sort of write it and then they read it and be like, this is not what I thought we were buying. I have very, very in-depth conversations with, it's like such a cliche term, but like the shape of the project and sort of the emotional beats of the project. And I find that because even if like you, and
Justin, we have a lot of questions. So
the last thing I'll say is I think that what ends up happening is when you follow the beats of an outline, even if you follow the beats, somebody reading it might not respond to the beats. But if the shape of it is what you promised, it's been my experience that they're kind of happy with it.
Thank you.
All right, my name is Sterling. This question, more like for Barry or Don. I have a question about coverage. And I've just had something go through coverage. And, a lot of writers in the room may be interested. I've read a lot that the coverage system is questionable in Hollywood. Can you speak about coverage and the expectations in coverage and what your experience with getting your work critiqued, and any advice basically on spec, working on spec?
It's a crapshoot in terms of coverage, because each production company or studio has a number of people, a number of readers who are delegated to read 20 scripts over a weekend and write coverage on it. So it's very subjective. I mean, if you're fortunate to get somebody who responds to your material, by the same token, you may end up with someone who doesn't. But it's a luck of the draw in terms of coverage. I've had good coverage and I've had bad coverage, just depending on who reads it. But in terms of spec, I've had a lot of movies made, but I've always preferred writing on spec only because it gives me greater freedom and the luxury of time. You don't have that pressure of, the studio executive calling, how's it going? But as I said earlier, it's risky because, you can spend time and money, not money, but time and effort, and you never have the script sold. So I prefer writing on spec and taking that risk. But, you have to pay the rent too. So anyway, Don.
Are you thinking that there's like something intrinsically wrong or corrupt with studio coverage or something?
I won't say per se, but there's a couple articles. I think LA Times did something a couple years ago about specs and the whole industry of writing on spec, whether it's a fair opportunity, I guess, for new writers, not getting into a writing program per se, and whether or not, when it comes time for your work to go through coverage, is it really a fair critique, I guess, that's more.
I'm not really that inside that process, but my impression is that I think it's pretty fair, but as Barry says, inevitably subjective to, whomever is going to be covering your script that day, and what kind of day they had and what their tastes are, and the fact that almost certainly they have 10 scripts that they're covering that day. That's a daunting thing to take in, but it's just kind of like the way it is for everybody, right?
For better or worse. I mean, executives are not going to read every script that comes in. They depend on coverage because it essentially, it states what the premise of the movie is, and then gives you a summary, and then it gives the person who's covering it their opinion on it. So
I think in general, I don't know if this is specifically a coverage thing, but I think generally, as we've seen recently, the system was weighted heavily toward white middle-aged men, and that's changing now, which is not great if you're a white middle-aged man, but broadly speaking, it's much better now. Just like the opportunities for everyone, I think, are opening up more now. Finally.
Hi, I'm DG. I'm a white middle-aged man, so I guess things suck for me right now. But I have a question actually for the entire panel. You mentioned that there are lots more opportunities now because it's not just the studio system, it's also streaming systems and indies and that kind of stuff. But what I'd like you to talk about is there were, when it was just the studio system, it was really heavily involved with ageism, especially in terms of writers. The oldest person who received an Academy Award for writing, both original and adapted screenplay, was 56 years old. Now I'm curious, now that we've got lots more outlets, are we seeing more opportunities in terms of people who are writing both on television and in indie stuff, older writers, or are we still seeing the fact that writers' rooms are still basically, if you're over the age of 50, you're starting to move out? If you're seeing people doing screenplays, there are very few people your age, Barry, your age, Don, doing stuff, or gray hair is now being appreciated or not?
James Ivory
Yeah, the writer Call Me By Your Name.
just won the Academy Award. He's like 90 or something.
Yeah, 90-year-old just won an Oscar for Best Adapted
Okay.
Screenplay.
Yeah.
For me, I think it seems like some of the most successful showrunners, at least in the dramatic form, got their shows later on in life. I mentioned Sopranos. David Chase was in his 60s during the first season of that. I think ageism is still a problem. I also think it's way more of a prevalent problem in comedy rooms. I think it's usually young 20-year-olds right out of Harvard, in comedy writer rooms. I think the dramatic side you have is just the way that it is, that you have a better shot if you're a little older.
Also, if you're writing on spec, it's not going to matter. Your script comes in, they read it, they like the script. They're not going to say, well, how old's the writer, or what is it, a man or woman, or
Then
whatever.
you have to go in and meet them.
Well, that's different. Well, but if they like you're going in on the predicate that they like the script, that they like the material. It's different, though, if you're going in for a job. That's a whole other area, too.
Okay.
I think, I mean, I just think it's kind of counterproductive to sit and worry about whether the business has ageism and sexism and whether coverage is fair and all of that stuff. That shouldn't be your focus. Your focus is to write material that you believe in, put your heart on those pages, and for every door that closes in your face because you're a woman or because you're a middle-aged man or whatever it is, kick down 5 more and go and get your content out there, or pick up a camera and make it yourself.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi there, my name's Shelby, and I have a question based more around amateur screenwriters that have yet to have their foot in the door. You guys touched upon it a little bit, but I'd like a more full answer from the panel if possible. Do you guys think that if you're writing your first script, you're trying to get it sold or you're trying to submit it to a contest or anything, would it be better to write something that does have guidelines like smaller budget or less characters, kind of like the one I love, or would you consider something off-the-wall, crazy sci-fi just to get their attention?
Unfortunately, I think, first of all, I said this last night, I think you need to write whatever you want to write.
Yeah.
You need to write whatever you want to see. Think about what you want to see when you go to a movie. That's first and foremost. Now, if you want to like delve a little bit deeper into the strategy of it, like what I said with the one I love, if you actually want to get a movie made and not wait for somebody to give you permission to make it, then yeah, I mean, if you have friends that you collaborate with, you call in favors, you do whatever it takes, you write something that is cheap to make. I mean, it's so easy this day and age to get equipment to shoot a movie, and you write something with the intent of making it, and you don't take no for an answer, like Teresa said, and you just go off and make it. The way that this movie studios are now, it seems tough to write a spec script that is $100 million movie and sell it, because the only things that are getting made are IPs, comic book movies, sequels, adaptations. It's just really tough. That's not to say it can't happen, but I think anybody's best bet to get their foot in the door, like Teresa said, is you don't want to get your foot in the door, you want to kick the door open, and the way to do that is to make your own piece of material and not wait for anybody to give you permission to make it.
Also, that material should have your own voice and should be unique and distinct. That somebody reading it, they're used to reading 10, 12 scripts at a time. Suddenly they see a script that has takes a different approach or is more quirky or oddball, or Tarantino or Shane Black have their own distinct identity in their writing. If you can create your own identity that makes it different than the other 12 scripts, that's an advantage.
And it depends on how you think and what you're attracted to. If you're a big, huge action director or huge sci-fi writer, then you have a responsibility to write that script. You don't have to write small. You can write a big spec and get it read. I think there are easier ways, but you should, it's just what Justin said. You have to write what you want to see and what's in your heart.
Guys,
I would say, or even, if for example, you're a huge sci-fi fan, maybe your challenge is to come up with a really clever, low-budget, doable sci-fi idea, because we're seeing that sort of thing more and more now, and people, really get noticed for that stuff.
Yeah, and if there's a kind of film that maybe, that you want to see that reflects more of your reality or your life that maybe that you haven't seen out there, I would say, that may be the movie to write as well.
I just got the 10-minute warning, so let's keep the next question. Yeah.
Oh no, I haven't published a young adult novel, but I adapted one to a screenplay.
Oh, okay, that sounds a lot better. Considering all your experiences writing screenplays, TV shows, movies, and all that, what would your experiences be with just the adaptation? What were your experiences with the actual publishing stories? Do you have any experiences that you can talk about? Because writing actual novels and writing screenplays for TV shows and movies, they are completely two different things. Do you have any experiences in relation to that?
Yeah, well, I did not work with the author very much on the script at all. I gave her a draft pretty late in the process to get her thoughts because I just didn't feel comfortable with the movie going out in the world unless I had her blessing, and luckily she gave it to us. But yeah, when you're adapting a book, it was my first time doing it, so I guess I'll report back after a few more. But it was a lot of fun. It's cool to have, especially if it's beautiful material. You have a great blueprint to work off of and a spirit to honor. And we had a book. It's out now, by the way, Random House, Words on Bathroom Walls. It's a really beautiful story, and she kind of made the job easy for me, in terms of mining the movie and mining the truth from the book.
Yeah, I could just add, I've written original adaptations. I've adapted a number of works by famous authors, Agatha Christie or Jackie Collins I did. So you're sort of hemmed in by the fact that you have to have a certain, I don't want to say respect, but a certain, you're relegated to following the structure of the material that you're adapting. So that kind of restricts you to some degree in your own creativity as a writer. But on the other hand, you're writing stories that are already laid out for you. So anyway, next question.
Hello, thank you all for being here. My question is for Don. I'm currently actually working on my first, hopefully, slasher film, and being kind of famous for that genre. When you're writing the script, is there kind of a difficult balance between, obviously people come to the film to see Chucky, and then, wanting to be invested in the characters, or the human-shaped knife holders, as they're referred to? Is that something that you kind of have difficulty with in the screenplay?
I'm sorry, I missed the term that you just said.
Human-shaped knife holders.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm sorry. So I don't understand the question.
Do you have trouble balancing between the flagship character of Chucky and then the trying to get the audience invested in the human characters?
I see. I hope not. You tell me.
All your films are amazing. So.
I don't know. Writing sequels, I find it a fascinating beast, actually. Because I think that any good story is about subverting expectation, and that's one of the things I like about doing sequels, is that they provide unique opportunities to do that, because you come to a sequel with a lot of preconceived notions based on what came before, and I feel like my job is to fuck with those expectations and see if I can pull the rug out from under you based on what you are assuming. But getting more to the specific of your question, Chucky is almost going to inevitably be, the most interesting character in the mix just because of what he is and what he does. But that said, I hope I've been successful in, making them not just meat puppets, just, because they're all stories, really. And with 7 movies now, I sort of see them as, there's the original trilogy, there's Bride and Seed, and then there's the last 2, and each of them sort of follow a different main character. It was Andy Barclay and the little boy from the original trilogy, and then in the latest couple of movies, it's this new character, Nika, the character played by Brad Dourif's daughter. So I really lead with that. I'm really trying to tell the story, like in these last 2 movies, Nika's story, and what might happen to her given the PTSD that she would have given the fact that she was battling a doll in the last movie.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rhonda. Thank you all. You've all shared a lot of information. If there was one word or one thing from each of you that keeps you going or inspires you, what would it be?
Word. Need a minute to figure
Bills. No, I'm sorry. That's not that. It's tough to do. It's tough to boil it down to one word. if got hard pressed, it would be what Don just said. It's subversion. I love, even if I fail, I love trying to come up with something that I haven't seen before, or a fresh take on an idea where, you know, there's a little bit of bait and switch where hopefully, you know, you bring the audience in and you have a premise and you better deliver on that premise and it better be good. But I'm going to give you, while I'm doing that, I'm going to give you something hopefully you haven't seen before. So subversion would be for me.
For me, it's probably empathy.
Character, probably. I think I feel a real commitment to my characters, and I want them to live so badly and actually get on screen that keeps me going, for sure.
Gratitude, I think. It sounds very earthy, crunchy, but we're so lucky to do this for a living. We really are, and it's just the best job in the world. It's so much fun. We were on the car over here. We were complaining, and then we were talking about how we love to complain. It's like if you don't work, then we're complaining. If you have too much work, you're complaining. But it's just a really wonderful way to make a living, and I like one of the best things about it is like the places I've traveled to, the people that I've met. It sounds too sentimental, but
no, that's okay.
End of the
Thanks.
panel. So
I would say creativity. Just it's the process. It's the actual writing process of just creating characters and generating emotion that hopefully an audience will respond to. Once you finish the work, then the difficult part is, you know, getting it sold, getting people to respond to getting it made. But the actual creative process is what I think keeps all of us going. You know?
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm an animation and film student, and my question is for the whole panel. Do you find that when you're making your characters, do you subconsciously base them off of other people, or do you make a conscious effort to make them as original as possible?
well, I think as writers, we're always drawing on our lives, and you know, people often ask me about, you know, what the genesis of Chucky, and it sounds glib, but Chucky is so much about my relationship with my father, honestly. So I think, yeah, I think we're constantly drawing on real life, right? I mean, I don't know if sheer originality is possible or even what you want.
Well,
you know,
everybody in here, this sounds like cliche and a little kumbaya-ish, but it's true. Everybody in here is original. Like, everybody in here is three-dimensional. Everybody here has wants and fears and is grappling with something as small as what you're going to have for lunch, and as big as I have a parent who might be dying. And so I think as far as characters go, the hope, I don't know if original is the right word, but the hope is they feel like a real human being. And even if the stuff that I'm mentioning right now about a family member dying or like a big thing isn't what the story's about, you hope that you get a sense of, okay, well, if this did happen to that character, how would that character react? And it's about making them feel real and flawed and complicated. So that's what I look for more than just original, if that makes sense.
I think there are parts of your characters that are you. They're your subconscious, they're how you're thinking, and they're the people that you meet and the people that you love and the people that you hate. I definitely steal from my friends and their lives. I have a friend who has this tiny New York apartment and was putting all this giant furniture in it and this very like large chandelier that no one could walk under. And I just thought, you're furnishing a house that you don't live in. And I thought that was such a good premise for a character. So one of the characters in my film that Aya Cash plays has that element of her life, but the character's not based on this friend. It's based on a plethora of people I've met throughout my life, and also like my own insecurities and fears and, you know, crazy mind.
Yeah, I don't, think so much about originality as much as I think about just avoiding cliches. And I think, when I sit down to write something, I'm really scratching at the surface to get to something truthful about somebody, a kind of person that I've met, or somebody I know, or something about my life, and make it specific enough so that it can be relatable and universal to others. So I feel like that is where I approach characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I've written biographies of famous people, but the only way you're going to get an audience to relate to those people is by giving them human elements that we can all experience we can all empathize with and relate to and identify with. So that's what it boils down to. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're wrapping up. Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists and the audience as well. It's been great.